From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
I'm with you, Shari. We've taken out a second home loan after our trip to Sydney's Royal Easter Show. Thank you very much, and hopefully you've had a wonderful long weekend. Happy Easter to those who have focused on the holy reasons for it. But if you just spent time with your family, it was a good weekend amongst us all. Now, as we know, the current Prime Minister was able to become the Prime Minister with the lowest vote the Labor Party had in the best part of a century. And in part that became clear on election night, even though there wasn't a majority of seats that had actually been won by the time he was taken to the stage. In actual fact, they had to wait until the results came in from Western Australia. This speech happened just after the polls had closed, and the assumption was that they would end up getting the seats needed to actually become the government. Now, where the Labor Party won its seats matters, because Western Australia is the new focus of a Newspoll tonight. You see, in Western Australia, they won 4 seats off the then Liberal Party. In New South Wales, 2. It was the Teals that did the damage there. Victoria, 2, but again, the Teals that did the damage there. And also in South Australia. There was no Labor seats that had been won in Queensland, which of course is quite the concern for them, and no changes when it came to Tasmania. Well, as we saw at the time, generally speaking, as it is for every government, regardless of when and regardless of which political party it is, you end up being swept into power and you create a backbench, a big enough backbench that by the time you go for your first re-election, you will end up burning some of those one-term MPs, because the big idea that you're taking, in the case of John Howard, would result in the popular vote actually being won by the Labor Party, but the most number of seats being held by the Liberal Party. Of course, the Labor Party had changed and then returned. They had changed the Prime Minister in its first term and saw a huge number of seats lost at that point in time. And of course, Malcolm Turnbull had stolen the Prime Ministership, which meant that they lost seats as well at the end of the first term of the Liberal government. So again, it is highly likely, unless somehow electoral gravity doesn't apply to this Prime Minister and this government, and the people around him would suggest that's the case. But at some point in time, they are going to lose some of what they had. You see, they only ended up winning 77 seats on the night, then the Aston by-election, which meant that they ended up getting to 78 seats. So they can only really afford to lose 3 around the country before we're talking minority government. Now, how they manage minority government is a debate for the 3 years after that, and let's not get ahead of ourselves when it comes to elections. The one that's in front of us will either be towards the end of this year or most definitely has to happen in the first half of next year. But in Western Australia, the surge that produced more seats than any other state in the Commonwealth for the Labor Party has now turned into, well, quite a dive. How many seats they will lose there at the next election is one of the big talking points behind the scenes amongst political people. Do they lose 1, 2, all 4 of what they gained? Well, we'll all wait and see. But of course, what happened since the election of the Albanese government in Western Australia? Now, of course, the Prime Minister spent all of last year and $450 million arguing for a constitutional change, and that, of course, being the voice. Now, it was 60-40 in the national vote of a hell no, but in Western Australia it was 63 and a bit percent of people who said, hell no, we don't want it. They, of course, had their experience with a crumbling state government that is appalling, particularly when it came to the national heritage laws. The same issues exist in Western Australia as they do everywhere else, of course, when it comes to cost of living. The front and centre that, of course, if you're trying to pay your house off, there have been 12 interest rate rises since the change of government, let alone all of the problems that have existed with inflation. And while the news might tell you, and people in Canberra will try to tell you, everything's looking better, well, when you go to the shops, you know that it is vastly different than when this government was hired. Western Australia, like everything else, has seen the Prime Minister spend an awful lot of time overseas on Toto 1, mucking around as Air Plus Albo. And whatever magical connection he seemed to have with Western Australia seems to have been broken because, again, Newspoll, they've been having a look at the past 3 months of polling and they've broken things down state by state. And it shows that the Labor Party is now down the best part of 3%, and that would be enough to flip at least 2, maybe 3 seats if there was an election held this weekend. Now, of course, there's not an election to be held this weekend, but you get my point. As for the Liberal Party, way back up, the best part of 5% meaning that the tight contests, well, they start becoming a little bit better, and maybe even the Teal seat that was lost, the old Julie Bishop seat, may well end up going back to the coalition. I don't know that that'll be the case for all the Teal seats, but that one looks like it's going to be particularly competitive. But as you can see here too, the only other people who went up are One Nation. Now, One Nation, who have produced a senator before from Western Australia, very nearly cracked places in the state parliament. It's one of those places that no one really talks about, but it has a pretty stable One Nation vote. Now, as I say, not enough to actually crack representation, but when preferences matter, 39% plus a significant amount of those that are in the One Nation camp, and presumably the same with the Clive Palmer, means the coalition becomes an awful lot more competitive. But the Greens, Teal and others, of course, are what keep Labor alive. But there's something that is also happening across the country that we need to have a look at over the past 3 months. And it is the huge disparities that we have in the different age groups in Australia and to whom they wish to park their vote. Now, when you have a look at this here, 18 to 34-year-olds, the Labor Party leads them by 6 points. 18 to 49, the Labor Party leads them by just 3 points. It was a lot higher, particularly in that 35 to 49 group in the 2022 election. Over the age of 50, well, the advantage is clearly with the Liberal Party, greater than even the advantage that the Labor Party has with the youngest of voters amongst us. 50 to 64 is 8% and 18% disparity between the Liberal vote and Labor vote for people over the age of 65. As they say, the older you get, the wiser you get, and in this case, politically, the more conservative that you get. But I want you to see there that there's clearly an advantage amongst the Labor Party with people under the age of 50 and a disadvantage over the age of 50. So you may be one of these people who's sitting back and saying, well, hang on, if they're losing here and they're losing there, how does it always end up that the Labor Party ends up just in front, say 51-49 or 52-48? Well, I'll show you. It's because, as I told you during the early stages when it looked like 60-40 yes vote for the referendum, there are more voters in Australia under the age of 50 than are over the age of 50, which is why your advantage with those voters, and in this case, the Labor Party in single digits but deep into double digits for the Liberal Party over 50, it means that, again, if everyone under the age of 50 voted in one way, they would outnumber the people who voted over 50. It's why there's always such a big battle between 35 and 54. But when we're looking at politics into the future, if you automatically look at that and go, well, OK, young voters are going to decide everything. Well, young men are increasingly more conservative than they were even 3, 5 and definitely 10 years ago. Now, their brand of conservatism is a little more Joe Rogan than it is Robert Menzies, but you get the idea that there are trends within trends and numbers within numbers. This is the show that tries to show you the data, and yes, I have a strong opinion about what I think it means, but I want you to know what is going on inside our country. Remember, Prime Ministers, well, they come and go based off the Newspoll numbers. And the Prime Minister is proudly telling anyone who'll listen, I haven't lost a Newspoll yet. But again, the data within the data, and thank goodness today the Newspoll organisation actually started to not just give us the headline numbers, but firstly break it down by states. Because you can see, if they're sinking in Western Australia, well, then seats will come off them, and the inevitability of us sitting around until very late on election night to work out whether the government is going to be barely in minority or a significant number in minority, and whether that's going to trigger 1 or 2 votes to get them over the line or a need to go negotiating with the Greens, well, that's again one of the stories that are going to be most fascinating about however long we have between now and whenever the Prime Minister decides to have an election. So you've seen when it comes to age, yes, there are more people under the age of 50 than over, but the advantage, 50 plus, gets way higher for the Liberal Party than the yes advantage Labor has with younger voters. But another example, and you've heard me talk about this before, but again, more data backs in the opinion that I've been presenting to you for a couple of years now, which is that, again, a major divide on how people are going to vote is, do you own your home? Are you paying off a home? Or do you rent a home? Now, fascinatingly here, this has nothing to do with age or geography. These are, again, national numbers. But according to the census, at the height of lockdown, so it was pretty indicative. There weren't a lot of people moving around and staying at somebody else's house that night, remember? It's basically a third, a third, a third. However, The larger of the thirds, if I can contradict myself, is of course the number of people that are paying off a mortgage. About 30% of the country has already paid off their house, but 30 and a bit percent, and that number will be higher since those numbers were taken a couple of years ago, are renting. Now, what's interesting about those thirds, again, is with the number of people who have paid off their own homes, so that's 31% of the market, the Liberal Party leads with people who've already paid off their house by 14 points. With the people who are currently trying to pay off their home, which again is the biggest section of the Australian housing market, the Liberal Party also leads, but it only leads by 3%. So this is absolutely the interest rate class. The class that the Prime Minister tried to pretend was being screwed over by the head of the Reserve Bank, but the reality was the new head of the Reserve Bank came in and said there's a lot more happening in our economy than just the bloke who used to be in charge of the Reserve Bank. Hence why they're currently trying to rig the way the Reserve Bank sets, or more importantly, cuts interest rates between now and the next election. But in terms of the number of people who are that are renting their homes, 30% of the country, the Labor Party leads with these voters by 12%. Now, you can say that's because they're younger, slightly more casualised work, whatever. But the point is, you've got an absolute majority of plus 14 for 31% who own their own home, and the Labor Party leads by 12% in people who are renting. So again, they both go to their corners, pretty much the same numbers. The people in the middle, they would split slightly more in favour of the Liberal Party, which again is why you read a little more into these opinion polls. But there's one little data point that I also want to share with you, which is that the Greens, amongst the entire Australian population, has the best part of 12% of the vote, give or take, depending on the poll. Amongst renters, they have 22%. Now, in the same way that Bob Brown used the environment to wrap around all of the other crazy that came with the Greens, this new generation of Greens are trying to use housing as the ultimate reason to vote for them, and look the other way with all of that crazy stuff that we've said on this issue and that issue and who's going to pay for it and how it's going to pay for it. Which is why you see the constant and endless needling of anyone who's in the property market and has an investment property by the Greens. So it's good to see every now and then when we actually see the detail behind these polls, because the Prime Minister's personal numbers are going down. Majority of people over the past 3 months do not approve of his leadership. It's interesting to see that when it comes to age, that we're in a scenario where if everyone under 50 voted one way and everyone over 50 voted the other, well, it would be the Labor Greens that would end up winning because there's more voters under the age of 50. But then it becomes a bit more complicated when we talk about where you are in the country, where the Labor Party is suffering a way bigger drop in Western Australia than, say, it is in New South Wales, where things are pretty much 50-50. But, of course, they're way in trouble in Queensland. They're surprisingly strong in South Australia. I think a lot of that has to do with a pretty popular state government. And, of course, where Liberal hopes go to die would be Victoria. So the reality of all elections is that there's 151 little separate elections that happen around the country, and you hope that people are watching the news so that if you win the day's news, then you start to move a message to an awful lot of people at once. But the reality of media as it is now, let alone the issues that drive us, is that there are places that have higher proportions of renters, which are going to probably lean more left, higher proportions of people that are paying off or own their homes that are probably going to lean a little more right. All of it is fascinating to watch, and I wanted to spend a couple of times on this public holiday for many people around the country to actually go through the data, and at the end of it, it's going to be a close election. But exactly which way it's going to go and how close for who, well, we'll all wait and see. However, the most likely outcome at this moment, if you made me make a prediction to bet, is it's going to be a Labor minority government. Just how deep into minority they are, well, see everything else I've just been talking about since the start of the show. One other little thing, and I mentioned it before, about the strength of Western Australian vote for One Nation, but believe it or not, while the endless focus of politics and those who talk about politics all day, every day, is to think that there are only three main political players running around in Australia, but as we learned out of Tasmania, Jackie Lambie, quite the say, as we've known out of Queensland for a long time, Pauline Hanson and One Nation have had plenty of push. But fascinatingly, According to the opinion poll that pops up in The Australian and the opinion poll that pops up in The Guardian, One Nation is up compared to its vote in the last federal election. 5% has now apparently become 7%. And again, this matters because if people do what they did in 2022, and that's say vote One Nation, but 50% go this way, 50% go that way, well, it ends up helping the Labor Party. But if the 5 to 7% of people who vote for One Nation, say, go 2/3 in preferences to the Liberal Party, like they did in 2019, the result becomes a lot better for the coalition. So that's why we should be paying attention to these so-called minor party results. It's also an excuse to play this bit of the Pauline Hanson cartoon on the weekend.
You know, ever since you boys went missing, Australia's really been thriving.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, it's been the best 3 weeks ever. Cost of living crisis is over, consumer confidence is at an all-time high, we've cleaned up the Indigenous industry so the money's actually being spent on those that need it, not just lining the pockets of the handful of elites. Even Sky News is happy.
You know what? Everything's great. So good night and sleep well, Australia. I always think the template is just fat Darren Hinch of what they've drawn, but I appreciate it and we've got to run. It's a great series. Make sure you go and find them on YouTube if you want to help pay for it. Well, obviously you can buy the rums and gins and all the rest of it there, but well done to Mark and all the people at Stepmates for finding a screen big enough for me to fit in it. Appreciate it. The old joke, how many people does it take to change a light bulb? Now, there's many versions of this. Sometimes these jokes used to be a little bit racist, but still, let's just put it this way. How many people does it change to change a light globe? And whatever the joke is from there. Well, there's a new version of this, which is how many planes does it take for Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese to be in the same place at the same time after leaving from the same place 20 minutes apart? Well, as you know by now, the answer is 2. Now, last week, they decided to make an announcement about $1 billion of your money, again, going into propping up a whole bunch of new renewable technologies that, among other things, are apparently going to increase the amount of solar panels made in the country. But the Prime Minister's word salad, as you may well have remembered, was that he can't promise that they'll be cheaper than the ones currently available from slave labour in China. But today, we got this excuse as to why 2 ministers flying from the same city, Canberra, needed to leave 20 minutes apart and couldn't sit on the same plane to go to an announcement in the same place on the same day.
The Prime Minister has a large jet available to him. That would normally be what we take. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jet, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for 2 small jets.
It was impossible for you to go together in the one plane.
Even the small jets weren't fully laden because of the weight restrictions on the. Even if we had, with the Prime Minister's security detail and other people involved, going from, as you'd imagine, the Prime Ministerial visit, 2 cabinet ministers, we limited the number of staff, and even then, that was the Air Force advice, the most efficient way of getting us there.
It's not the only way that you can travel around Australia. You see, if you wanted to, you could fly to the Williamtown Air Base and get in a car. Although, as the Prime Minister's told us before, his mobile phone doesn't work in those, so if there was a national security issue or just more boats flying into the side of the country, that wouldn't work. Well, then there's a bus, but no, those are only saved for campaigns, of course, because then you can have all the media together. So he absolutely had to fly into the smaller airport rather than just drive, like everyone else would, from the slightly larger airport. But can we show the photo again? Because the thing I don't quite understand here is that we know the Prime Minister went, we know that Bowen went, we know that our mate Ed Husick went. We also know that there were 2 state government ministers, but we don't believe they flew. So could you explain to me, when you have a look at the photo of the 2 planes on the tarmac, how 3 people and the Prime Minister's security couldn't fit in one jet? Now, I know that every window doesn't mean a seat, but presumably there's enough seats for the people to go who were talking in front of the cameras. Well, Ray Hadley, quite correctly, has called out Casanova as being, well, as full of it as always.
I have an email from someone who was an employee in the area that tasked VIP Air Force aircraft. And he says, with some clarity, and I have confirmed it, I can politely say that the Prime Minister obviously doesn't know how the system works. Ray, the Royal Australian Air Force does not provide assets until all approvals are provided to tasks directed by the PM's department. So we're directed by the PM's department to supply aircraft at their request.
So this nonsense of, the Air Force told us, well, okay, they found you a big enough plane for the people making the announcement. Perhaps not a big enough one for all of the staff and all of the hangers-on, but they still had enough for the security guards. But no, they definitely needed 2 jets to make a point about flying into the Hunter region in New South Wales to make a $1 billion taxpayer announcement that they were throwing more money at renewables because we're about saving the planet from 1% of global emissions. Okay. Now, about the actual announcement, though. Now, I did touch on this on Thursday, but I do think there's something more to talk about here. And it is the types of companies that got a slice of money out of the start of this $1 billion fund. Now, the $1 billion fund is for companies to apply to get grants of a few or a lot more $1 million to help upsize their operations, because what they are doing is helpful to Australia producing more solar panels or building more wind farms or perhaps some R&D into hydrogen or you name it, right? That's the idea. But again, there's a detail here that not too many people seemed all that interested in. And as fascinating as the 2 planes story is, there's another story here, which is I'm a bit surprised that one of these companies ended up getting taxpayer money when presumably some of the people that are involved in the company would be able to foot the bill that the taxpayer has now stepped in to pay for. Let me explain. Now, the Prime Minister's office, this was their press release on the day where they announced the $1 million Sunshot. Now, a moonshot policy is something like let's cure cancer or let's fly to the moon by the end of the 1960s, something that seems impossible, but it's this big idea. So someone's been very clever, and instead of saying moonshot, they've gone sunshot because it's about solar energy from the sun to fix 1% of global emissions. So, again, the way this was reported by the faithful was, among others, that a $1 billion bet on Australian-made solar panels was part of what came out in the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, one of the people who was at the announcement and presumably gets some of the money, I'm not entirely sure how much of the money, I don't believe it's a huge amount of money, but it's millions of dollars, I understand, happy to be corrected, is a company called SunDrive. These are the people who are going to make more solar panels here in Australia, and as more people put solar panels on their roof or more parts of regional Australia are covered in solar panels, we'll feel better about ourselves because they're made by Australians, not by slave labour in China, like more than 90% of the solar panels that exist in the country.
Our plan is to produce, in our first phase, hundreds of thousands of panels on this site, with the eventual goal of scaling that to millions of panels per year.
Okay, sounds like a good idea, sounds like a good company, sounds like exactly the type of thing that, okay, a little bit of support from the government might get them up and over the line. But I question why the taxpayer needs to find the money for these people when a billionaire is a very significant investor in the company. Surely he would be able to give some of the money, and a former Prime Minister who's worth a pretty penny himself may also be able to maybe go halves? Why do the taxpayers need to get involved in this as if it's some sort of small business? And even if it is a small business, it's got the big backing of a billionaire and a former Prime Minister. Oh, and one of the people that are their strategic advisors is the bloke who, of course, helped roll Tony Abbott to become Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, and he, of course, then became a minister, the youngest. Oh, okay. Good to know. So there's people in and around this company who know how government works, including how to get money. But you would imagine that this company would be able to ring the people who own it or invested it to invest the money to build the solar panels because it will grow their business. Put simply, why are we paying for it? Now, last week we spent a lot of time, and I think quite fairly, on how this federal government is using non-disclosure agreements to shut people up while they are negotiating what the decisions they are going to make are. Now, the end of this rainbow is that the Prime Minister or a minister stands up and makes an announcement, and all of the people who signed the NDAs are standing behind them, making it look like they've all completely signed off on what the idea is. But the reality is that companies who are afraid of government getting back at them for, say, if you disagree with this policy, we'll regulate this part of your business. So last week, all of those car companies turned up to talk about the major backflip that wasn't actually a major backflip when it came to the ute tax or the big car tax. This has happened before when the Prime Minister signed a UN agreement about how much of our economy would end up relying on renewable energy and the cutting of 43% of 1% of the world's global emissions. Now, this system is one where basically, if you want to have any relationship with government, and government has got a million ways of coming at you if they do not like you, they can overregulate you, or they can just simply not take your phone call when, say, you've got a great idea about solar panels, but you're not going to get the money because the one that's backed by the billionaire and the connection to the former Prime Minister and a former minister, they're the ones that end up with the taxpayer funds. This is how Pauline Hanson explains the system, and the system is dodgy for anyone who cares about transparency.
Stakeholders have been invited to see some parts of the plan, but the restrictions on these people are extraordinary and anything but democratic, transparent or accountable. Before they're allowed to even enter the room, they must sign a large confidentiality agreement with heavy penalties, which stops them from discussing the plan's contents or even going into the room in the first place. Stakeholders are told they can't take photographs of the draft legislation and can't take any part of it with them.
So does that seem like a government that is trying to work out an idea for the country, or a government that is just trying to shut everyone up, telling people they can't even go back to the organisations they represent in order for them to be able to still stay in the room so that when, say, $1 billion falls from the sky, you might be able to put the application in? That's what part of the inference is here. Now, remember what the promise of this Prime Minister was and compare that to what Pauline just said.
A more honest and transparent government going forward. We will make it transparent. We're being transparent. We will operate in a transparent way. Transparent. We've been transparent.
Getting people to sign non-disclosure agreements, telling them they can't have a copy of the legislation, let alone non-disclosure agreements that say that if they represent a company, they can't go back to the company and tell them what the details are of the document that apparently everyone's negotiating, sounds a little bit like take it or leave it, doesn't it? Not quite the promise that was made by this Prime Minister. It's all about managing media. Because, you see, when you turn around and say, look, we're going to have an idea, it's going to be, we're going to try to put a price disincentive on polluting cars. OK, so let's have a few meetings. Well, then all the people in the meetings end up talking to the media about what some of the solutions might be, and then the opposition blows up about what those people hear, and that, of course, causes trouble for governments. So let's just cut out the middleman and tell everyone they can't say anything. And they don't really provide much context to be able to actually negotiate anything. Well, old Casanova Bowen actually owned up to this today and said the process is completely okay.
Car companies came to us and said they wanted to share commercial and confidence data with the government and asked for the negotiations or the consultations to be held in that light. And so we agreed to that, and therefore there were those sorts of agreements entered into.
So he's going to pretend that the reason that everyone had to sign the NDA was because the companies wanted to share the information? OK. Well, what about the NDAs for the Religious Discrimination Act? That doesn't affect any data that car companies have. What about the people who are currently looking into the Our Nature future? This is the whole EPA and a whole bunch of new green laws where NDAs are being signed. Again, nothing to do with car companies. This is them just pretending that we're the government and we're in charge. But it's the car companies who made us tell everyone to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We're the government and we could all go on one plane, but it's the Air Force that said we needed two. Oh yeah, but we're in charge of everything, right? Vote for us. Let's talk about Joe Biden and his big weekend. It has been a big few days for him. He'll need a big lie down, won't he? A big lie down. And take off his special orthotics and have a little rest. Because, as we know, this is the president that defies gravity by falling up the stairs and apparently will be, looking good for re-election despite the fact his poll numbers are particularly bad. Well, actually, funny, by the way, the diversity hire that is his press secretary, and she was on radio in Georgia, in one of the southern states of the United States, and she was asked by a radio announcer, is the president okay?
When I told a number of people that I was talking to you today, it was interesting, though, they all said, would you please just ask her, does the president have dementia? So before I move on from that, does he?
Mark, I can't even believe you're asking me this question. And with that, thank you so much, Mark. Have an amazing, amazing day.
Wow. And she hung up. Wow.
By the way, Charlotte, North Carolina, not Georgia, but still a swing state. So they're just hanging up now rather than giving any answer. The full clip, of course, is her just talking about anything but the answer that she should be giving, which is yes. But that wasn't the biggest news in Biden world this weekend. In fact, the former presidents that, of course, Bill Maher referred to as the expendables of the Democratic Party, kind of passed it people, Clinton, Obama, current president, they got together for a fundraiser that apparently raised $26 million, people paying $5,000 a ticket to listen to them being interviewed by Stephen Colbert. Oof. There was no homeless people at the front to just give the money to because that would have been more productive. This raised $26 million, which, by the way, is being interpreted by lefty media as why Biden's fundraising dominance could save his campaign, because the money will get them rather than anything else. But one thing that is starting to happen inside Biden world is that the most regular voters for the Democratic Party, which are African-American voters, particularly African-American women, but certainly African-American men, well, they're now starting to creep their way towards Trump. This is something that could be significant enough for Biden to lose re-election. A point that was made in joke form on Saturday Night Live, and listen to the lefty audience shocked at firstly a good joke and secondly a good joke about their guy.
President Biden said Friday that he would visit the site of the Baltimore bridge collapse because, like that bridge, Biden is no longer connecting with black communities. You got to read the polls.
Wow.
Now, all of this would, of course, add up to a good weekend for Donald Trump, unless, of course, you count the types of things that he's been posting on his Truth Social account. Now, please don't send me emails about the context. Please don't tell me that really this is something better than it looks. But why does Donald Trump decide to put a photo up of somebody that was in one of those truck convoys for Trump that's got Biden hogtied and tied up in rope as if he's in the back of the truck? It makes it too easy for all the people who should be defending the record of Joe Biden to simply point and say, do you want that guy to be your president? Quick break. Back with more. Lots to talk about on a special Holiday Monday edition. No jackets, no kicking back, just a good old-fashioned chat. We'll have it for you next here on Paul Murray Live. The late debate is here. Rita Panner here as well. Well, how's this for a chat? Three of our best, all in one place at one time for you this Holiday Monday, none other than Senator Matt Canavan. He joins us now, as well as Linda Scott, here in the Man Cave. Happy Easter to you too, my friend, in the screen in the background. And Graham Lloyd, who is, of course, the Associate Editor of the Australian newspaper. Rather than just a little quick hit on one issue, he's going to be here for lots of different issues. All right, Matt. How many people does it take to put in a light bulb? Well, apparently it takes 2 planes for the amount of ego that needed to go and announce $1 billion of our taxpayer dollars going off to industries that are in part and companies backed in by billionaires and former prime ministers, because that's where the money's needed.
Well, don't laugh, Paul. A few years ago, that was a question at Senate estimates about light bulbs. I think it was 3 or 4 people we needed to change the light bulb in an electorate office somewhere around the country. But yes, the waste in government knows no end here with 2 planes. I mean, look, I've got no problem with the Prime Minister and his ministers from time to time using private airlines to get around the country. They're busy people and commercial flights don't always work. But you can't tell me they couldn't have saved here. They could have had some staff go commercial or just not need that many staff. These jets can fit 8 or 9 staff usually with the jump seat in the middle. So I don't see how this adds up at all. And what makes it, of course, a lot worse is these are the same people telling us all that we can no longer buy a Ford Ranger or a Toyota Hilux without paying a massive penalty under their vehicle emission standards. And yet they think nothing of just taking 2, of course, fossil fuel-powered jets to a press conference for publicity. Either they don't believe in climate change and all their demon-like predictions, and it's just all just a front, or they're just massive hypocrites, total hypocrites. And if only we could bottle the hypocrisy from green activists and turn that into electricity, we'd never have another blackout again.
I'll tell you where, Linda, the criticism comes from me on this, right? So in the same way that the left would talk about the greenwashing of a fossil fuel company desperately trying to rechange its image by sponsoring a sporting club, right? If these people are literally going to an announcement about backing in a version of Australian industry that is about dealing with climate change because we're very close to, if not past the point of no return, don't you show your seriousness by trying to find the smallest footprint to get there, not, oh, we need to because we've all got to come?
Look, it's absolutely important that all elected leaders walk the walk, right? There's no argument about that. But let's not forget the time when Susan Ley charged the taxpayer to go to the Gold Coast to buy a $795,000 apartment off a Liberal donor. Let's not forget the time...
She wasn't trying to take your ute off you.
Let's not forget the time when the Greens flew around the country. You know, Maureen Faruqi flew to go to the ICC World Cup. I mean, we've got example after example of people in our elected class off the back of the public dollar flying around the country or driving around the country on the public purse and using these entitlements. Everyone
does it?
Well, it's not okay. This is my point.
Well, so then it's not okay for the PM and Bowen to have done what they've done, right?
I'm sure that they will put more effort into being more careful next time. But I can understand why the public gets annoyed about this stuff. And I think when you look right across the parliament, the public has a right to expect that, you know, people are going to behave prudently with the public dollar.
Well, I'm fluent in Linda. She agrees with us. Now, let's talk here, Graham, about the actual fund itself. Now again, this philosophical idea, right, which is there are billions to be made and hundreds of thousands of jobs in the greening of Australia, right? So why does it need any taxpayer money to help push it along? But again, and I'm not suggesting there's anything nefarious at all about the company that Cannon Brooks and Turnbull are involved in. But if they need $5, $10, $15, $20 million out of someone to build more solar panels, couldn't they just ask the billionaire or the multi-millionaire who owns their company for that money before they ask you and me to pay for it?
I think this is what the average person would think. What it displays is a complete lack of self-awareness on the part of the ruling class that extends to taking the airfares and then subsidising rich people to build panels that we know are going to be more expensive than the things we can currently get from overseas, and then presumably subsidise households to buy them. This looks like it has a lot more to do with politics than it does economics. I think we're going to see more of it, but people will be scratching their heads as to why rich people need money to do a commercial endeavour. I mean, if it doesn't make money, why do it?
Yeah, I mean, again, Matt, part of this here is that I get that the best spin on this, right, is that it's a small industry that needs to grow to a bigger industry, and then it will be a flourishing one that will end up. But it's going to make the very people who were there in the early days pretty rich while those things exponentially grow, right? Take any other example of hypercapitalism, and that's what ends up happening. But my issue is that these deals should also come with equity. Like, why doesn't it have a scenario where, all right, if you need $10 million off us, then we're going to get 5% of an asset that we might be able to sell later, our shares in it, or when this becomes a multi-billion-dollar company, it's a new source of revenue for governments.
Or a loan, for example, that would be another way of doing that, and that's often what we did when we were in government. The government is trying to do some of those things, so it's not clear why they couldn't issue this particular investment, some kind of low concessional loan. Like, I do support government trying to bring back more manufacturing to Australia. I do agree with Graham, though. This particular decision seems to be totally driven by politics, nothing to do with economics. I mean, they're going to the Hunter Valley and ringing the death knell on the coal industry, despite the fact that we're exporting a record amount of coal. There's a record demand for coal overseas. It makes no sense, but they obviously want to kill the Australian coal industry, and this is them trying to make the medicine go down easier for people. And then, of course, you've got a glut of solar panels in the world right now. There's a total glut of them all around the world, largely because of the subsidised industry that occurs in China. But there's no serious plan to deal with that. I mean, if we were serious about developing a domestic solar production industry here, why wouldn't we put tariffs or ban, like the Biden administration has done, those solar panel manufacturers who are using slave labour? Why would we at all consider putting solar panels on our roofs that are made from slave labour? And if the government were serious about supporting Australian solar production industry here, they would do that very minimum thing. The fact they're not, I think this is just actually for the PR. It's not really serious about developing an Australian solar production industry itself.
Well, don't forget, of course, we still have taxes on cars that are imported to the country, which was all about protecting cars made in the country, but we don't make cars in the country anymore. So what? But then again, we still compensate for a carbon tax that doesn't exist. Oh, okay. Now, just last one here before we take a quick break. Graham, help me out here. So a Greens MP has turned around and blown up Deluxe, right? This is just playing to her crowd. Cool, good luck to her, but she's playing to her crowd, right? Which is, why is taxpayer money put into a coal-guzzling, puffing billy and not taxpayer money put into music festivals, which it feels like are closing by the day? This is about as free a kick as you're going to get, mate, so feel free to go for the full 6.
Yeah, well, there you go. It's all about, this is a party that believes the government should be responsible for paying for everything. There's the thing with the puffing billy, this is actually a publicly owned asset, and they're paying the insurance, so, you know, kids presumably can enjoy themselves having a trip around on an old school train. What's being called for here is the government to pick up the business expense of the music industry. I have a lot of sympathy for the music industry. I think they're being regulated out of existence. I think there's a lot of things that should be done by government to assist them, but paying the bills of the private sector isn't one of them. And unfortunately, the Greens seem to think this should be the model for government holers bowlers.
Yeah, I mean, Linda, isn't the example that local council, state government, federal government, when industries go, well, OK, look, we're starting to hit the wall here, they find ways to make the costs of the events cheaper, as opposed to the Greens just turning around and saying, I know you're really annoyed about losing insert in the insert this year, but government should pay for it.
Look, live music does need saving, but you don't need to kill Puffing Billy to do that. It's utterly ridiculous. And indeed, in the inner city of Sydney, we've had Greens senators shutting down live music themselves through making noise complaints themselves. We had former Senator Lee Rhiannon in Surrey Hills, in my electorate, complaining that the bar underneath her, which was playing live music late at night, i.e. not when she was meant to be in the office.
Not 2 a.m.
She was calling the council and making noise complaints and trying to get the bar below her office shut down for playing live music and employing excellent Sydney musicians. Like, this is just crazy.
We'll agree.
And we do have music festivals under threat. That's terrible, but you know, we can have Puffing Billy at the same time.
Yeah, look, just any opportunity for us all to get to the Unity ticket on a public holiday. I suppose it's not as spicy as it may normally be, but we're all on the Unity ticket on the Greens. We'll try and split that harmony in a moment or two's time. Quick break. Back with more here on Paul Murray Live. Thanks for watching. Jump onto the socials. Tell us what your bold prediction for the week is. Graham Lloyd is the Associate Editor of The Australian. You can find it online, find it in the newspaper, of course, tomorrow when you're heading back to work, or school holidays, of course, in Queensland. Enjoy. None other than the wonderful Matt Canavan, who will be, no doubt, getting the paper, but also taking care of kids as a mixture of school holidays, because that's the way it works, even when you're an elected member of our federal parliament. And a lady who works hard for local councils, working on the City of Sydney Council, but representing them at National Cabinet, yeah, that big, is none other than the wonderful Linda Scott. Now, Matt, digital ID passed through the parliament, and I know that there are people who have believed that Australia has taken a step for the worse as a result. What is it, and what does the law place in and around why we needed it?
Well, look, I think the most shocking thing of what happened last week is the laws passed through the Senate without any debate at all in the chamber. There was a committee process which we asked a number of questions, and honestly, a lot of those questions weren't answered very well by the departmental officials. And I and others had developed a lot of amendments, and we expected to have a lengthy debate about those as we normally would. But instead, the government teamed up with the Greens to just guillotine or gag debate, we call it, and force through votes on those amendments and the bill itself without any debate whatsoever. And so the Australian public aren't that much of a wiser. It goes to the House of Reps now, almost certainly will be sailed through there because the government has the numbers. But this is concerning because particularly people who are using digital IDs will hand over sensitive data about themselves and their own profiles without any updated protections in the Privacy Act. One of the amendments I and the Coalition did move, but without debate moved, was that we should not introduce any digital ID regime in this country until we've made the necessary changes to our Privacy Act that would update that act to factor in your facial profile and other attributes that may be passed on to private companies and government. The government is sitting on a report on that and is not pursuing that. So we think we're putting the cart before the horse here. On top of that, the government says it's voluntary, this scheme, but there are a lot of exemptions for it. Businesses can exempt themselves out of it. State governments can too. We had amendments to deal with that. But again, they all went down because there was a cabal in the Senate. It's very unfortunate. It's not just this bill, but your nation's Senate is being run by a Green Labor cabal right now. And I'd encourage people the next election, elect some senators that are actually going to do the job of the Senate to hold the government to account and review very important legislation like this, because it's not happening at the moment.
I agree, but they of course say that it's completely voluntary about whether we use, tap and go all the time or cash. But well, good luck trying to pay for cash or anything at the moment. You know that people start to look at it like it's poison. Remember, of course, as Bob Catter was able to show at the cafe thing, or the trough as it is called, in Canberra, they still have to take the actual money. Graham, what about Harry Triguboff? Now, Harry Triguboff is one of those people who's been able to literally change the skyline of cities around the country. He's changed his business on top of that to a whole bunch of sort of service departments around the country, and plenty of people may well have spent some time in those. He made an interesting comment yesterday on AM Agenda. Can we roll the tape?
And what do you think about young people and our work ethic? I think I'm still going to call myself young in this conversation.
No, not the best.
No? No. What do you see?
Before, we all knew that we had to work, and we accepted it. And now, we start saying, I like to work, but I also like not to work, and this and that. Not good. Now, the women, I find, are much better. They're more reliable. No? They work. All right. The guys, not the best.
Who's he talking about? Well, perhaps this person on TikTok, the Chinese surveillance app.
But being in the position that I'm in, going from working full-time, it was more than full-time if I'm honest, to taking a whole year off, doing whatever the actual I wanted, to the thought of going right back to where I was before, I think just has me awoken to how insane working 40 plus hours a week is. I am genuinely so scared that the second I start working full-time, all of the progress I have made on my physical health, mental health, will just go absolutely out the window. I think I have decided from experiencing this that my biggest goal in life is to never work full-time.
Oh, Graham. Are you with Harry or are you with her?
Well, I think Harry came from a generation where people worked every hour that was available, and they were thankful, A, to have work, and B, to have things to sustain them. There is a new generation. The whole work-life balance has become a bigger thing, but you can't on the one hand embrace that and on the other complain that you can't afford to do anything. So I think people will move from an idealistic phase to grab the reality that things don't come for free.
I'm with you. Linda, I've got about 40 seconds here. One of the things that we need to talk about in the lead up to the budget is how much money local council has, particularly to deal with disasters. You told me before, 60% of the local government areas in Australia have been dealing with a disaster.
In the last 2 years.
What?
And you know, they just need help, right? We've got a great disaster ready fund. This is a fund that local governments can apply for from the federal government for disaster prevention, but it's been massively oversubscribed. The government's own figures show there were 300 applications and only about 187 were funded. That means heaps of local governments trying to prevent the impact of disasters before they happen, but just can't get access to the funding. So we hope in the lead up to this budget, the Prime Minister and Treasurer Jim Chalmers up that funding by about $250 million to allow local governments to better protect our communities from increasing natural disasters.
And if nothing else, Grim Jim, the reason that they get the extra money, just, Linda's had to put up with all of us every time she comes on the program, all right? So just sort of a bit of danger money keeps her coming back to a conversation with
debate.
Graham, the Senator, and, of course, the lovely lady that is Linda. Thank you, guys. Do appreciate it. Enjoy being back at work tomorrow. All right, quick break. Back with more Late Debate, 4 minutes from now. Thank you so much to James Morrow for being in the chair last night. It was awesome to have an extra day with the family. We did our best to clean up the house, but I think we're going to have to do it again next Easter. Here's the Late Debate.